These verses should be a welcome tonic if your time in God's word is wearisome at the moment, if you're frustrated by your failures or distant in your devotion, because in his thankfulness to God, the psalmist in this stanza reminds us of just how good God's word is. Now, I know, like any of you, that if you're not really feeling something, someone who's really enthusiastic can sometimes be really annoying. But honestly, stick with me if you are feeling weary or frustrated, because I think you'll find that the psalmist's enthusiasm is infectious rather than off-putting. So let's dive in with verse 129. The psalmist writes, speaking to God, "Your statutes are wonderful, therefore I obey them." The statutes, God's words, they're wonderful because of who they came from the living God, and they're wonderful because of what they do, transforming our lives. And so the psalmist does the obvious thing, he obeys. Verse 130, the unfolding of your word gives light. It gives understanding to the simple. And no matter how spiritually dull you're feeling, or indeed how spiritually dull you may be, no matter how dark the pit you find yourself in is, this verse tells us that the unfolding of God's word gives light. And whether that unfolding happens in your heart as the Spirit works in you as you read in private, or whether God works through a friend or a preacher as they open up God's word to you, as God's word is unfolded, its light shines. And so the psalmist says, verse 131, knowing the goodness of God's word, I open my mouth and pant, longing for your commands. He yearns and yearns for more of the wonderful word that shines light into his life. And that yearning transforms into a confident prayer. Verse 132, turn to me and have mercy on me, as you always do to those who love your name. The psalmist prays because he knows he can't do it on his own. This enthusiast, turns out he's not that far from us after all. He's all too aware that he needs God to unfold his word to him, that he can benefit from these wonderful things. And yet he also has a sure confidence that God will turn to him, because that's what God does. God is gracious to those who call upon his name. So his prayer is a confident prayer, a prayer he knows his good God will answer. And the psalmist yearns and prays for the light of God's word, not only because his word is so good, but in the second half of the stanza, because the darkness is all around the psalmist. It's in his heart, verse 133, direct my footsteps according to your word. Let no sin rule over me. The psalmist knows he needs God to mercifully turn to him because of the sin that's within him, the sin that threatens to overcome him. Or verse 134, redeem me from human oppression, that I may obey your precepts. The psalmist knows he needs God to mercifully turn to him because of the opposition that surrounds him, the oppression that stops him keeping God's law. The danger, it's within, it's without, it's everywhere. And so the psalmist prays, verse 135, make your face shine on your servant and teach me your decrees. It's a beautifully personal prayer, verse 135, because the God of the Bible, he isn't some distant deity ruling with an iron fist from afar. No, it's a very different picture here. He's a teacher who lovingly draws us into his presence, that his face may shine upon us, that we may benefit from being with him. It's a wonderful thing, the grace of God, a wonderful thing the psalmist knows. And yet as he looks around, and maybe as he looks within, he's also all too aware. He also knows the darkness of the world we live in, maybe too the darkness of his own heart. And so the stanza that began with wonder ends with weeping in verse 136. Streams of tears flow from my eyes. Why? For your law is not obeyed. The psalmist weeps because the wonderful light-giving word that is worth longing for, panting for, desiring above all else, is ignored. It's so good, and yet it's treated so badly. And so he weeps. And so if you're wearied by God's word, frustrated by your failures, distant in your devotions, or maybe you're all too aware of the opposition to your obedience, both within and without, well, allow the psalmist to recalibrate your heart to the wonder of God's word, and shed a tear with him as you lament our love of the darkness. But most of all, pray with confidence, with the sure hope that the psalmist had for God's mercy, knowing that he will turn his face to those who love his name and teach them his life-giving, light-shining, wonderful decrees.